Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. In this episode of my podcast, The Global Agora, Nicholas Herring, Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Gothenburg, discussed the complex relationship between public concerns over climate change and actual support for climate policies. While surveys consistently show that Europeans overwhelmingly view climate change as a serious threat and support ambitious climate goals, there remains a striking gap between this concern and acceptance of concrete measures, such as carbon pricing or the removal of fossil fuel subsidies. Herring explains why fairness perceptions and political leadership are key to bridging this gap, how public experiences of climate impacts shape attitudes, and why hope and effective communication are essential for sustaining climate action in democratic societies. And what does he think about Greta Thunberg and about the effect of the Donald Trump administration's actions on fighting climate change? Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. According to a survey published by the EU in June, a large majority of Europeans continue to view climate change as a serious global threat, with 85% of citizens identifying it as a major problem and 81% back the EU-wide goal of climate neutrality by 2050. How can governments and political parties that view the climate crisis as a real threat use such public support effectively?
I think that's a very interesting question, of course. What can governments do? I think these studies, we see them over and over again. We find that people in European countries are concerned about the climate issue, they're aware of it, and so forth. They want their governments to take action. But on the other hand, we also have studies showing that people are somewhat opposing several of the instruments dealing with this issue. So people are oftentimes opposing introduced carbon pricing, such as carbon taxes, removing fossil fuel subsidies, and so forth. So there's kind of a gap between the concern for the climate issue and the support for the policies dealing with this. And that gap is more or less what motivates my research. That's what I do research on. And a couple of years back, we made a big meta-analysis. So that's an analysis where you take data from several different, as many studies as you can find that have a high quality, and you make a new model. And from that model, you try to identify which factors are the most important factors. What we find in that study is that fairness perceptions are very important to explain why people oppose or why people support these kinds of instruments. And that could be based on kind of personal fairness. So why should I take on these costs? I use my car to get to work. It's a huge problem. Why should I take these costs? Or it could be more social fairness. So based on how you view distribution between different groups in society, say now these kind of removing fossil fuel subsidies will affect rural poor people living in the countryside that need their cars and so forth. So I think that what governments can do to get support for these policies is to design and communicate policies in ways that address these concerns. So they have to, and also then show political leadership, showing and explain why we have to take on certain costs in order to deal with these large problems. In the same way as politicians have to make us understand why we have to take on costs for, as we have in Europe now, wars or investments in welfare systems. So it's taking these concerns about fairness issues, consider them, and also show political leadership. I think that's what they can do.
By the way, you mentioned that you are focusing or what motivates your research is this gap. Why did you decide to focus on this?
I think I wouldn't say it's paradoxical, but to some extent, of course, if we find over and over again that people are very concerned about this issue, it's often described as kind of the most important defining issue of this generation. We have all these kind of big words about it, but at the same time, when we try to deal with it, introducing policy instruments that by the science community, if you take economists, for example, they say that carbon pricing is the most cost-efficient way to do this. It's also based on fairness principles that people mostly agree with. So it's based on a polluter pays principle, which people perceive to be a quite fair principle in general. But then we have this resistance when we have the actual policies suggested or introduced. And I think what are the factors there that explains this gap?
Europe has seen repeated heat waves, devastating forest fires, also this summer, and other extreme weather events in recent years. Does this direct personal experience of climate change make the public more receptive to climate policies, or could it instead lead to a sense of fatalism and helplessness?
I've seen some meta-analysis on this as well. And the short answer there is that personal experience alone does not have a very strong or consistent effect. But of course, it varies in between studies. So where we can think that it depends on who's affected, what's the media reporting like, and so forth. But also individual level factors, such as belief systems. So people that are not that concerned about climate change, not really convinced that it's due to human activities and so forth, linked to their political ideology or certain political parties that they support and so forth, that will affect how they process that information, of course. Another thing that I think is important is that how emotions work with this. This is mostly from psychological research, but there's research there that says that hope is important in the reporting of this or in the information about climate change in order for people to be willing to take action. So I think I will kind of caution against the idea that people will wake up only after the catastrophe. So I think that perspective is quite cynical and also risky. Kind of waiting for the disaster is not a very responsible climate strategy. So I think that also introducing some hope to people, pointing at the solutions and so forth.
I also don't think that the personal experience, especially if it is a one-off thing, even very catastrophic, can change people's minds very quickly. But I've been at places, for example, in Africa, when, I don't know, the farmers there told me that where we were standing, there was a river or there was something. They were raising crop. Now it's a desert. So maybe also this kind of more long-term experience with the effects of climate change is even more important than just one-off event, as much as could be extremely cataclysmic.
I think that's a very good and relevant observation that, of course, we have for a long time talked about the future consequences of climate change, but to many people, these consequences are here and now and very real. And of course, that will put pressure on the political system or on politicians to take action.
And talking about public perceptions, how is the climate and political activism of quite famous Swede Greta Thunberg perceived these days in Sweden?
I haven't seen any recent kind of systematic studies on that. However, I think that Sweden being a quite small country, I think it's fair to say that many Swedes feel some kind of national pride, as we do with other famous figures like Zlatan Ibrahimovic or successful Swedish companies such as IKEA. So even though Swedes may not always agree with what Zlatan says or what IKEA does and so forth, I think there's some kind of, I would say, national pride in it. At the same time, of course, Greta's activism also has critics, so political commentators that, even more critical when she has expanded her focus beyond the climate to other issues, the situation in Gaza and so forth. But also many political commentators that are very inspired by her courage and consistency in speaking out for what she believes in and so forth. So I think that, it's of course divided. But when Swedes are kind of talked about in international media, I think that most Swedes feel some kind of, maybe national pride is the wrong word, but if someone from your village becomes famous, you like that.
So you like that? I mean, you personally, if I may ask.
No, of course, I think that she has been very consistent in her climate activism. I'm a researcher, so I'm not an activist myself, but I think it's important to have a clear distinction between research and activism. At least I want to have that. So I think that the best way I can contribute to this is to do as objective and the best kind of research designs and so forth in order to get better knowledge about these issues. And I think that can help politicians and the policy society to design better policies that are more fair, that are more efficient, more effective.
We mentioned a couple of things, and there is, of course, a broader debate on whether and how fast the EU, but not just the EU, but let's talk about the EU, should move toward climate neutrality, taking into account economic difficulties, the rise of China, and the Russian war against Ukraine. How do you reconcile the widespread public concern we mentioned regarding climate policies with the growing political and social greenlash, and the rise of political forces that at least partly denied the climate change, climate crisis, and they like to wrap, at least in my view, they like to wrap their denial into how we should use common sense when addressing climate-related issues?
It's of course a difficult balance, and politics is about making priorities. And as we talked about before, there are some fairness concerns with this transition, and it's about who should take the cost. Climate change, it has like spatial and temporal and social dimensions to it. So should we pay for future generations? Why should we take on costs in Europe if the Chinese or the US, if they don't do anything? Should more rich segments of society pay more and so on? So it's always, of course, it opens up for making these priorities, and different political parties can kind of try to use that in order to gain votes and so forth. But at the same time, I think that we talked about extreme weather events before, and I think that these are forcing societies to adapt. People will demand responses when their homes or communities are at risk. So I think that this will force political parties to also have a climate agenda, and also that we see that markets are developing, technologies are developing. So I think regardless of politics, we will see better technology, battery technology, solar panels, electric vehicles, and so forth that are advancing rapidly. And politicians have to deal with that also, that people will adapt to new technologies, and they will demand that their societies adapt to these new technologies if they are cheaper. So demanding reasonable charging stations, electrical vehicles. So political parties will have to have ideas about that as well in order to gain votes, I think.
The International Court of Justice just recently issued an advisory opinion that inadequate action on climate change may violate international law. Do you think this will become a part of the discussion about how we should address climate change, that we have some kind of legal opinion and we have to do something?
I'm not a scholar of international politics, so I cannot say much about how the response there will be. But of course, I think that actors that want us to move forward faster when it comes to the climate issue, they will try different means, different ways for that to move forward. And if that is to use the legal system, or if it's other kinds of activities. I think we will see people trying to take action at different levels because they are concerned about the issue and they want us to move faster.
Talking about politics, every comparison is imperfect, I know that, but the trajectory seems to me that this trajectory is somewhat similar. Like in the case of migration, in which many mainstream political parties embraced more radical far-right ideas, something like that is also happening in the debate linked to the climate change. Do you agree or not? And if you do, what is your explanation for this?
I know that there's also research by political sociologists showing that these kind of attitudes or preferences are linked to each other. So people having these maybe anti-migrant positions are also being more skeptical towards climate change and especially climate change policies. So I think there's that connection. And there are, of course, parallels, so taking on costs and so forth, but I would be a bit cautious about making direct comparisons. I think that, as we just discussed, I think that climate change, the costs of inaction are increasingly visible. And I think that people will not accept bearing these costs without political responses. So in that sense, I think it's a bit different. But here, yet again, I think that political leadership matters. Leaders do not just follow opinion, they also shape it by framing climate action as fair and necessary. I think that will also affect people's opinions or positions.
Yeah, political leadership. The current US administration of Donald Trump is undermining, or I dare to say, is actively rejecting and fighting against climate policies. So from your perspective, if we are talking about the political leadership, and the US is one of the most important countries in the world, what does it mean for the global efforts to mitigate the climate crisis?
Of course, it's kind of highly significant when the world's largest economy withdraws from the Paris Climate Agreement. It sends kind of a negative signal internationally, and it could, of course, kind of weaken the momentum in global negotiations and so forth. But at the same time, I think that it's important to also say that change is not only driven by national governments. So we talked about this, that market dynamics are pushing new technologies forward. And in some cases, renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels, and that will change societies, even if Donald Trump doesn't impose climate policies. And we also see action at other political levels, states, cities, and businesses continue to move ahead, regardless of what US president or the US government does or not. So, of course, US leadership matters a lot, but I think it's not the only driver of global climate action. Sending a bit of hope, maybe, that is important.
Yeah, I think so, definitely, even though I have to say that looking at the American policies right now, it's hard to have this hope, but I agree that we need to have hope. But there is also this debate, and I think you saw that there is always, from the other side, from people, political parties, they don't believe in the climate change. They want to weaken the climate policies, that this or that study regarding climate change was imperfect and this and that. So basically, this is a clear cherry picking. We know what the scientific consensus is. But how do you react on media reports like this? I mean, as I said, this or that climate studies is maybe not 100% accurate, and then there is a backlash against everything.
I think that there's a kind of, as I see it, competition between different political forces out there. And of course, when something is in line what you think, then you will try to use that and push that in your channels in order to say this hoax, or saying that the situation is very, very severe, we need to take action from the other side. But as a scientist, I believe in these meta-analysis that we discussed here before, or systematic reviews. There are, of course, different scientific results, but the main finding there is that human activity is causing climate change, and climate change will have effect on us experiencing more extreme weather events and so forth, even though we cannot always say that this weather event is linked to climate change. And we know that on a more systematic level. But of course, you can see how different actors use different kinds of results to push their agenda, of course.
So to wrap it up, and I will somehow return to the beginning of our conversation, how much can democratic governments, let's say, coerce people into believing in climate change and maybe even into changing their lives and changing economic models if necessary?
It's kind of a normative question, and I think that it's something that's kind of political thinkers have thought about for a very long time, the relationship between the citizens and the state. First of all, I think that we cannot, or liberal democracies cannot coerce people into thinking anything, more or less. But in liberal democracies, we think that education should be based on the best available science. And as we just said, the science is clear. Human activity is driving climate change. And that is what should be taught in schools and at universities and so forth. And whether governments can use coercion to force people to change behavior is, of course, an interesting question. And I think that the mainstream political science or economics, these kinds of problems that climate change is understood as, so we oftentimes understand them as collective action problems or social dilemmas where our individual contributions are tiny and it's meaningless to take action unless others don't take action. And that's where governance or coercion is needed. It's necessary. It's even what motivates government or the state from the beginning, that we need some third actor that coordinates our actions and help us collaborate. So, I mean, from that position, it's not that problematic that governments introduce coercive policies that force people to change their behavior. But these governments should, of course, have a democratic mandate. They are winners in the elections. And as I said, that's where I think it's very important that democratic leaders can show leadership. Because if you want to do something about climate change, then you have to explain why we take on these costs in order to avoid catastrophic consequences for everyone in the future. In the same way that democratic governments have to explain to their voters why we should take on costs for defending our countries, having national defense or helping other countries in that situation, or why we should have taxes in order to pay for welfare services. So I think that's why I think that political leadership is necessary and important.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also a description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.